We need to talk about what happened, and I'm here to help you through this.
The air in the administrative office tasted like stale coffee and aggressive sterility, a sharp chemical tang that stuck to the back of the throat and made it difficult to swallow. I stood perfectly still near the filing cabinets, my feet planted shoulder-width apart in a posture of non-threatening compliance that I had practiced in the mirror 1,000 times before. To my left, the ticking of the analog wall clock seemed to echo like a gavel striking a sounding block, counting down the seconds of a future that was rapidly disintegrating. Directly in front of me, Principal Skinner did not look like an educator concerned for the welfare of a student. She looked like a hunter who had finally cornered a particularly elusive quarry. Her finger, trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and indignation, pointed at my chest, not at the embroidered crest of the National Honor Society on my varsity jacket, but at the perceived threat beneath it. She was speaking to the dispatch operator on the phone, her voice pitched high to convey a sense of immediate danger that simply did not exist in the room. She used words like aggressive and insubordinate, descriptors that hung in the air like smoke, obscuring the reality of the boy standing before her who was merely asking why his schedule had been changed without his consent. I could feel the weight of my backpack pulling at my shoulders, heavy with a heartbreaking irony. Inside that canvas bag was an AP Calculus textbook, a notebook filled with meticulously annotated history notes, and a college application essay drafting the importance of civic duty. Yet, in this suspended moment, none of those credentials mattered. The meticulously curating of my academic identity, the late nights studying until my eyes burned, and the perfect attendance record were being systematically erased by a narrative that was centuries older than the school building itself. When the heavy double doors swung open, the atmosphere shifted from tense to kinetic. 2 officers entered, their hands already hovering near their belts, their eyes scanning the room for the source of the disturbance. They did not see a scholar. They did not see a student council treasurer. They saw a suspect. I watched the scene unfold with a terrifying sense of detachment, as if I were floating near the ceiling tiles looking down at a tragedy happening to someone else. This is the mechanism of survival for young men who look like me. We learn to dissociate from the trauma of the moment so that we can analyze the logistics of staying alive. I calculated the distance between myself and the officers. I calculated the speed at which I should lower my hands if asked. I calculated the tone of voice required to sound submissive but not guilty. The principal turned to the officers, her expression shifting from fear to a smug vindication, and uttered the sentence that would eventually ignite a firestorm she never anticipated. She told them I was trespassing. She told them I refused to leave the premises. The absurdity of the accusation was almost enough to make me laugh, but laughter in this context is interpreted as resistance. I remained silent, a statue of dignity in a room chaotic with bias. The first officer stepped forward, the jingle of his equipment sounding jarringly loud in the small office, and reached for my arm. The cold shock of his grip was the anchor that pulled me back into my body. This was not a misunderstanding anymore. This was an erasure. The long corridor stretched out before us like the throat of a beast, the polished linoleum reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead in a way that made the world feel surgically sterile. As the officers guided me out of the administrative office and into the main artery of the school, the silence was absolute and suffocating. Classes were in session, meaning the halls were empty, turning what should have been a public spectacle into an intimate, ghostly procession. I passed the trophy case I had helped fill, my eyes tracking the golden figurines and framed certificates that celebrated the very institution now actively trying to criminalize my existence. It was in that hallway, flanked by 2 armed men while wearing a backpack full of advanced placement textbooks, that the true weight of the black tax settled onto my shoulders. This concept is often discussed in economic terms, referring to the financial support successful black professionals provide to extended family, but the currency I was paying with in that moment was far more expensive than money. I was paying with my peace, my dignity, and the cognitive load required to remain stoic while my future hung in the balance. The black tax, in its most visceral form, is the requirement to be twice as good to get half as far, and the simultaneous burden of knowing that even your excellence offers no immunity against the presumptions of guilt. It is the energetic surcharge levied on existence itself, an invisible invoice attached to every interaction in a predominantly white space. The principal, watching from her doorway with arms crossed and a satisfied set to her jaw, believed she was merely enforcing discipline. In reality, she was collecting this tax. She was extracting a penalty for my audacity to question her authority, for my refusal to shrink in the presence of her bias. She believed that by involving the police, she had successfully transferred the power dynamic back to the institution, reclaiming control over the student who spoke too clearly and knew the handbook too well. She saw a trespasser. I saw the culmination of a systemic failure that I had been preparing for my entire life, even if I hadn't realized it until the cold metal clicked around my wrists. As we neared the exit, the tension in my chest was not born of fear, but of a terrifying clarity. This was not a random event. It was the inevitable collision of three specific narratives I had been navigating since childhood, three lessons that form the architecture of survival for students like me. To understand why I didn't cry, why I didn't beg, and why the video that was currently saving to the cloud would eventually dismantle her career, you have to understand the three distinct pillars of my education. These were not lessons found in the school curriculum. They were the syllabus of the invisible school I attended every day after the final bell rang. There is the lesson of the code switch, the lesson of the paper trail, and the lesson of the mirror. Without these three stories, what happened next would look like a tragedy. With them, it looks like a trap that the hunter walked into willingly. I walked through the double doors and into the back of the squad car, not as a victim, but as a narrator waiting for the second act to begin. The principal thought she had closed the book on a disruptive student, but she had merely written the opening chapter of her own undoing. The fluorescent hum of the precinct holding room was indistinguishable from the silence of the library, where I spent the better part of my sophomore year. In both places, time seemed to stretch and warp into an oppressive stillness, but in the library, I was building the armor that would protect me in this very moment. My father used to tell me that mediocrity was a luxury I could not afford, a soft pillow reserved for those whose benefit of the doubt was guaranteed at birth. For me, excellence was not a pursuit of glory or a pathway to a scholarship, though it certainly looked that way to the guidance counselors who smiled too wide and spoke too loud. No, for me, excellence was a defensive strategy. It was a form of martial art where the weapon was a transcript and the shield was a flawless attendance record. I learned early on that if I wanted to survive the ecosystem of a suburban high school, I had to be undeniable. I had to construct a version of myself that was so mathematically perfect that any accusation levied against me would shatter upon impact with the hard reality of my resume. This was the defense of excellence. It requires a level of vigilance that borders on paranoia. It means that when you write an essay, you do not just answer the prompt. You cite sources obscure enough to prove you read the footnotes, yet authoritative enough to be unassailable. It means that when you sit in the back of the class, your posture must be upright, your hands visible, your notebook open, because a slouch can be interpreted as defiance and a closed book as disengagement. This defense comes with a heavy tax. It demands the sacrifice of spontaneity. While my peers were making the foolish mistakes that define adolescence, skipping class to smoke behind the bleachers, failing a test because they stayed up too late playing video games, I was curating a portfolio of perfection. I could not afford a rebellious phase because for a boy like me, rebellion is often categorized as criminality. So I traded my youth for security. I remember a specific Tuesday in 11th grade when Mrs. Garris accused me of using AI to write my analysis of The Great Gatsby. She felt the vocabulary was too advanced, the sentence structure too complex for a student who wore hoodies and listened to trap music in the hallway. She did not know that I had read the book 3 times, or that I had spent my weekends memorizing the cadence of Fitzgerald solely to dismantle her prejudice. When she confronted me, I did not raise my voice. I did not get angry. I simply opened my laptop and showed her the version history, the timestamps of every edit, the evolution of every paragraph from rough thought to polished prose. I walked her through the metadata of my own intellect. The look on her face was not an apology. It was fear. She realized then that I was not just a student, I was a paralegal of my own life, documenting my existence in real time. That victory felt hollow, but it taught me a vital lesson that I carried with me into the back of that squad car. Being innocent is not enough. You must be visibly, painfully, aggressively excellent. The principal made the mistake of assuming I was just another body to be managed, a statistic to be disciplined. She did not realize she was arresting the captain of the debate team, the state math champion, and the editor of the school newspaper. She saw a threat to her authority, but she failed to see the fortress of academic distinction I had built around myself, brick by diligent brick. By the time the officers ran my name and saw the awards, the scholarships, and the letters of recommendation filed in the system, the narrative had already begun to shift. Excellence does not stop the police from being called, but it forces the world to ask why they were called in the first place. The air in the administrative hallway felt pressurized, thick with the static electricity of an impending storm, yet the only thunder came from the woman standing 5 feet away from me. While the principal allowed her voice to climb into the jagged registers of hysteria, turning heads in the main office and causing the secretary to pause her typing, I initiated a sequence that every black boy in America learns before he learns long division. It is a psychological mechanism I call the internal volume knob. In that moment, surrounded by the accusations of a theft I did not commit and the looming threat of law enforcement crossing the threshold, my internal monitor visualized a mixing board. The fader labeled anger was pulled all the way down to 0. The fader labeled fear was suppressed to a low hum. The master volume of my existence was lowered until I became a void of threatening characteristics, a silence so profound it forced the chaos around me to echo back onto its creator. This is not merely about being polite or respectful. It is a tactical survival strategy, a high-stakes form of code switching that goes far beyond vernacular. It is the conscious modulation of one's entire frequency to ensure that the predator instinct in authority figures is not triggered. I watched the principal's face flush a mottled red as she gestured wildly at my backpack, her accusations sprawling and incoherent. She was begging for a reaction. She needed me to shout back, to clench my fists, to roll my eyes, or to display any microaggression that would retroactively justify her decision to escalate a minor misunderstanding into a criminal event. She was writing a script in her head where I played the villain, but I refused to read my lines. Instead, I stood with my hands visible, palms open, shoulders dropped, and eyes fixed on a point just past her left ear. I modulated my voice to a pitch that was scientifically non-threatening, a smooth baritone stripped of all bass and cadence. This is the exhaustion of the double consciousness. While my peers could afford to react authentically to injustice, screaming when they are wronged or crying when they are frightened, I had to function as my own public relations firm and legal defense team simultaneously, all while my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The police officers, who had just arrived and were unholstering their assumptions along with their equipment, paused. They looked at the screaming educator, and then they looked at the statue of calm standing before her. The internal volume knob had done its work. By stripping myself of all emotional output, I had created a vacuum that the principal rushed to fill with her own unprofessionalism. The contrast was jarring. The video that would later exonerate me captured this dynamic perfectly. It did not show an unruly student being tamed by an administrator. It showed a dignified young man being assaulted by the chaotic noise of a system losing its composure. The silence I curated was not submission. It was a mirror. And in the reflection of my absolute stillness, the officers began to see the principal not as a victim, but as the only source of disorder in the room. I had turned my volume down so low that the world had no choice but to hear exactly how loud she really was. The smell of cedar sawdust and peppermint always preceded the most important lessons of my life, drifting from the small woodworking shed behind my grandfather's house in rural Georgia, where the air was thick with humidity and history. It was there, amidst the scattering of chisels and the hum of cicadas, that I learned the architecture of the stillness I now wielded like a weapon in the principal's office. My grandfather, a man who had lived through decades that tried desperately to strip him of his manhood, never raised his voice. He operated with a gravitational pull that forced the world to slow down around him. I remember him holding up a piece of rough oak, running his calloused thumb over a knot in the grain, and telling me that the strongest wood is not the one that bends, nor the one that snaps, but the one that simply refuses to acknowledge the wind. He called it the discipline of the mountain. He taught me that in a society designed to view my emotions as a threat, the most radical act of rebellion was absolute, unshakable composure. This was not a passive lesson about turning the other cheek. It was a tactical instruction on psychological warfare. He explained that when authority figures attempt to bait you, they are essentially handing you a script, expecting you to read the lines of the angry, unruly suspect. If you refuse to read those lines, if you burn the script with your silence, they are left improvising in a panic. In that sterile office, with the principal's voice rising to a shrill crescendo and the police officers shifting their weight by the door, I felt the heavy hand of my grandfather resting on my shoulder. The lineage of survival was activating within my blood. The principal thought she was berating a 17-year-old student she could easily intimidate, but she was actually colliding with 3 generations of strategic dignity. I was channeling the lessons of men who had stared down lynch mobs with nothing but a suit and a prayer, men who had walked past jeering crowds to integrate schools without flinching. This was the intergenerational link that the video footage would later implicitly reveal. The camera captured a boy who seemed possessed by an old soul, a young man who sat with the posture of a deacon in a front pew rather than a suspect in an interrogation room. I was drawing from a deep well of ancestral competence that the principal could not fathom. She was playing checkers with her petty authority, while I had been trained by grandmasters to play chess with my life. As the officers watched me, the dynamic in the room shifted subtly but undeniably. They stopped looking at me as a potential threat and began to view me as a peer, or perhaps even a superior in terms of conduct. The silence I maintained was not empty, it was filled with the presence of my mentor. I could hear his voice drowning out her accusations, reminding me that my dignity was a fortress that could only be breached from the inside. If I did not open the gate, she could not enter. The principal was exhausting herself trying to batter down a door that did not exist, attacking a phantom of her own prejudice, while I sat there, safe within the legacy of the mountain, watching her dismantle her own credibility brick by brick. The police were no longer guarding her from me, they were witnessing a masterclass in character, taught by a ghost. The fluorescent hum of the administrative office seemed to drop in pitch as Officer Miller finally reached for the remote control on the conference table, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were handling a loaded weapon rather than a piece of plastic. This was the moment the narrative transferred from the subjective volatility of human memory to the cold, unfeeling objectivity of digital recall. The principal sat forward in her chair, a smug tightness around her mouth, her eyes darting between the blank monitor and my face with the anticipation of a gambler who believes they are holding a royal flush. She was entirely convinced that the camera would reveal the phantom menace she had conjured in her mind, a version of me that was aggressive, threatening, and insubordinate. She needed the screen to validate the fear that justified her escalation, to prove that her decision to summon law enforcement to a place of learning was a necessary defense rather than a hysterical overreach. I remained still, my hands folded on my lap, breathing through the diaphragm just as my grandfather had taught me, knowing that the truth does not need to shout to be heard, it only needs to be seen. The monitor flickered to life, displaying the timestamp in stark white font against the grainy gray of the hallway feed. We watched the past unfold in silence. There I was, walking from the library to my locker, a solitary figure moving with a distinct lack of urgency. The time on the screen matched the time of the incident perfectly. The digital ghost of myself stopped at the locker, dialing the combination with precise, unremarkable movements. Then, the frame shifted as the principal entered the shot. On screen, without the audio to carry her shouts, her body language screamed louder than her voice ever could. We watched her rush toward the student, toward me, with jagged, erratic gestures, her finger jabbing the air, her posture encroaching on my personal space with aggressive entitlement. The contrast was physically painful to witness. The boy on the screen did not flinch. He did not posture. He did not raise his hands in fists. He simply stood there, a statue of composure amidst a whirlwind of administrative rage. The silence in the conference room grew heavy, transforming from a tense weight into a suffocating realization. The officers, trained to read body language and assess threats, shifted in their seats. I saw Officer Miller's jaw tighten as he watched the woman in the blazer corner the boy in the hoodie. The visual evidence stripped away the context of authority she relied on. Without her title protecting her, she looked like an assailant, and I looked like a victim who had mastered the art of de-escalation. The video continued, showing me quietly closing my locker and stepping back, retreating not out of fear, but out of a clear desire to disengage from conflict. The principal followed, her gestures becoming more frantic as she realized she was not getting the reaction she wanted. She was fishing for defiance and catching only dignity. When the screen finally went black, the reflection of the room stared back at us. The principal's face had drained of color, her mouth slightly open, the triumphant smirk replaced by the hollow look of someone who realizes the trap they set has sprung on their own leg. The police officers did not look at me with suspicion anymore. They looked at her with a mixture of confusion and professional disdain. The receipts had been printed, and the cost of her prejudice was suddenly, undeniably clear. I did not need to say a word. The moral victory had already occurred in the quiet space between the end of the video and the next breath. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, severing the connection between the sterile interrogation room and the rest of the world, and for the first time in an hour, the air felt breathable again. We walked down the hallway, the same linoleum stretch I had traversed 1,000 times between classes, but the geometry of the school had fundamentally shifted. The lockers, the trophy cases, the faded motivational posters, they no longer held the authority they once did. The silence between my mother and me was not empty. It was heavy with the things we no longer needed to say. We passed the front desk, where the secretary, who had previously avoided our gaze, now looked up with a tentative, almost apologetic curiosity, having sensed the shifting tides by the demeanor of the officers who had exited just moments before us. Those officers, men who had walked in ready to enforce the law against a delinquent, had walked out leaving a business card and a nod of respect, not for the institution, but for the calm resilience of a family that refused to be broken. We pushed through the double-glass doors and into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun cutting through the clouds to hit the pavement with a glare that forced us to squint, a harsh but welcome return to reality. Inside the car, the atmosphere was sanctified, a private decompression chamber where the armor could finally be loosened, if not completely removed. My mother did not start the engine immediately. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles rising like islands in a sea of tension, and stared straight ahead through the windshield at the brick facade of the school. I watched her profile, seeing the exhaustion that lived beneath her strength. The victory inside that office was undeniable, but it was a victory that came with a tax, the emotional energy spent defending one's right to exist in a space that claimed to welcome excellence but grew suspicious when that excellence appeared in a certain shade. We had won, yes, but the lesson I took away was not that justice is blind. The lesson was that justice, in our world, must be guided by the hand of irrefutable proof. I realized then that the camera on my phone, the meticulous archiving of my movements, the time-stamped reality I had curated, was not paranoia. It was survival. It was the modern shield required to navigate a landscape where presumption of guilt is the default setting. As we finally pulled out of the lot, merging into the flow of traffic that cared nothing for the drama we had just endured, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a profound clarity. The principal was not a villain in a movie. She was a banal administrator of a systemic bias, dangerous not because she was evil, but because she was so certain of her own righteousness that she couldn't see the truth until it played out in high definition on a monitor. The counter-story here wasn't just about proving I didn't do it, it was about exposing the machinery that assumed I did. I looked out the window as the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood rolled by, realizing that I was returning home different than I had left. I was no longer just an honor student. I was a witness to my own life, a chronicler of my own truth. The fear that had gripped my stomach when the police were called had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard understanding of the rules of engagement. I would continue to excel, I would continue to rise, and I would continue to break records, but I would never again make the mistake of thinking my accolades alone were enough to protect me. The receipts were not just for today, they were the blueprint for how I would navigate the rest of my life, walking with my head high, my hands visible, and the truth always, always ready to be played back.